We are going to move directly to our second panel examining some of the downstream consequences of wildfires on government budgets, energy prices, and property values. Our moderator is my friend and colleague, Greg Roston. Greg is the Gordon Kane Senior Fellow at SIEPR and director of the Public Policy Program at Stanford University. He was also the interim director of SIEPR before I took the baton January 1st. Greg, thank you for moderating this panel. The floor, the stage is yours.
As you said, I'm Greg Roston. I'm a senior fellow here at SIEPR. In doing these quick introductions, I'm going to be like I am in the classroom and assume you've done the reading or will do the reading about the speaker. So the introductions are going to be pretty short so that you have time to hear them talk. Suffice it to say, all three panelists here are really well informed and were selected to provide different perspectives from their positions in different government agencies about these economic issues relating to wildfire. Before I do that, I wanted to start with, we kind of hear the disasters and other things like that. I wanted to start with good news, which is this morning, my wife was reading her email and she said, "Good news, we got our homeowners insurance renewed." So I thought that was good news. I'm an economist, and I was dying to ask her how much more it cost up. But I realized, I'm also an economist, I realized that divorce is a lot more expensive than so I didn't ask the question. So let me think about, first just give you the introduction for the speakers. First is Rachel Ehlers. She's the Deputy Legislative Analyst at for the Environmental and Transportation section of the California LAO. In my mind, the LAO is the California equivalent of the Congressional Budget Office. In other words, it's the group that takes a lot of input, does its homework, and comes out with apolitical, analytical reports that people trust. That's a really important role in California and in government in general. Second is Nisa Fligler. Nisa is an attorney, a policymaker, and a politician. She combines everything. She's worked on very local issues in Los Altos as an elected member of the city council and mayor, and regional issues affecting the peninsula and beyond in her job as part of the Santa Clara County Assessor's Office. Last but not least is Coco Tomasian. Coco is an engineer and program manager of the Safety Management Systems branch within the California PUC in the Safety Policy Division. And the PUC, as you've already heard a little bit, is on the front line of wildfires, and he's been working on threat assessment, mitigation, and infrastructure safety. So for the next hour, we're going to hear each of the three panelists to give some brief remarks about their role in their organization and their own specific role, sort of the role of the organization in thinking about these issues, and then their own specific role in the context of wildfires, focusing on the economic and social impacts. Then I'm going to have some questions for them, and then there's going to be discussion amongst the group. And there's going to be time for your questions as well. So I don't know if you guys want to sit down and just give your opening remarks or whether you want to stand up, but I think sitting down makes it more conversational. So Rachel, do you want to go first?
Sure. Good afternoon. I'm Rachel Ehlers. I work for the California Legislative Analyst's Office. We are similar to the federal CBO, although one distinction we have is that we are explicitly told through statute to provide recommendations to our bosses in the legislature, whereas the CBO is explicitly told not to provide recommendations. So that's our bosses want to hear from us. So I work for the Senate and the Assembly, the Republicans and the Democrats, all members of the legislature. We provide fiscal and policy analysis to them. We are independent. We are nonpartisan, not bipartisan, but nonpartisan. One way that perhaps you have directly interacted with our work is that we are tasked also with describing and analyzing the fiscal impacts of potential ballot initiatives. So when you get the ballot right up before every election on the propositions that is now grown to be kind of doorstop level, that comes from our office as well. So I work in the Environment and Transportation unit of our small but mighty office. We have about 35 analytical staff. There are 6 in my unit of Environment and Transportation. And wildfires become one of the big topics that we have been spending a lot of time on in the past 10 years, I would say. Huge increase in area of emphasis in the legislature. starting with some of the big fires in 2017, 2018, as you heard in the prior panel. We as a state have started spending a lot more on upfront prevention activities, forest health. That really wasn't a big part of the conversation or of budgets prior to 2017. Now it is billions of dollars a year. Also on the policy side of things, each of the major fires we have, I think, has really changed the conversation. We started talking around 2017 a lot more, not enough according to Scott, but a lot more about forest health and burning and putting fire back on the land. I think that the LA fires are changing the conversation even more to talk more about home hardening, about urban fires, about ember spread, not just what's happening in the forests, but also what's happening in communities, and also rebuilding standards. So in terms of the economic impacts, I think they are so widespread, it's hard to know what they are. One of the best studies I've seen recently was out of Blue Sky Consulting, Tim Gage's group that was funded by the Moore Foundation. They estimated that between 2017 and 2021, the average annual economic losses from wildfire in California was $117 billion annual. And that the subset of that was the state's fiscal impact, was $5 billion a year. So that's the direct impacts of losses, of spending on debris removal and fire response activities, but also lost income taxes, sales taxes, economic activity from the state budget. So $5 billion state budget, $117 billion annual economic impact in the state. So that's pretty significant, even in a big budget like ours. So I think I'm the government budgets part of this panel, and also happy to talk about kind of what's happening within the legislature. But I think we decided to keep our intros short so we can get to your questions and discussions.
Am I next, Greg?
Great, yes, you are.
Hi, everybody. As Greg said, Nisa Flagger, and I am Special Assistant to the County Assessor. It's funny, I see a lot of familiar faces, and many of you know that I am not soft-spoken, but I actually just got back from Napa, and my immune system did not love the Napa area, and so my allergies have been acting up, so I apologize in advance. Happy to be here. My other role, as Greg mentioned, is I also am a local elected official. I serve as Vice Mayor on the Los Altos City Council. The Office of the Assessor, let me start by saying we're not the tax collector. We get phone calls all the time related to the tax collector office, and we happily either answer the questions if we can, or we refer them over to the tax collector, whose office, fortunately, is right next door. With me this afternoon, we have our Assistant Assessor, Greg Monteverde, and also Autumn Young, who's our Deputy Assessor, and we all just came back together. So the Office of the Assessor, if you're not familiar with what we do, it's basically we identify and locate all assessable, all taxable real and business property in Santa Clara County. And we identify the property, we apply any exemptions, and Greg just mentioned homeowners exemption. We apply any laws that are applicable, but our primary goal is really to identify these properties and assess them and place them on the roll for that year. When I think of in the context of a wildfire or a disaster, honestly, our role doesn't change, right? We're still required legally to accurately and efficiently identify property and the current value of that property. And so if there is a reduction or a decline in the value of that property, that is our responsibility. We're not tasked with trying to maximize the value of property in Santa Clara County. It's really to identify assess the true value of the property. Common questions we get related to disaster and wildfire in the assessor's office, and I'll start with the homeowner's exemption, because we do get folks asking, my house was destroyed in a wildfire or some other disaster and I had to move out temporarily. Will I lose my exemption? No, you would not lose your exemption. Another question we receive frequently has to do with, my home was destroyed. If I rebuild it, will I still have the same base year value? Yes, if it's rebuilt in a similar like manner, and this is legalese. It's not properly defined, what does that really mean? But if, for example, you were to build a new bathroom, so add square footage to this rebuilt home, then we would assess that additional square footage based on that market year value. So that's the difference, and those are the types of questions we answer in the assessor's office. But stepping back and looking at the bigger question today about the economic impact of wildfires and other disasters, the assessor's office provides the information that's very helpful to our county and our county executive when there is a disaster. We are not directly impacted. We talk about the impact on our staff, because no surprise, if there's a disaster, we do need more resources, hands-on, reaching out to property owners, ensuring that files are getting filed, which I'll talk about later. So in our office, we may have to increase the number of resources to help during a disaster. But our office isn't directly impacted when you talk about an economic impact. But the impact to the county is vast, depending on the extent of the disaster, and that's a role the assessor's office plays. Another thing about Santa Clara County Assessor's Office, I could do does anybody know what our annual assessment roll is, at least in 2024? It was $700 billion. We are number 1 in the Bay Area and number 4 in the state. We just saw the assessor from LA, and of course, their annual roll is in the trillions. So that's our annual assessment roll, and that's what our team in the assessor office works on an annual basis. So look forward to the other questions and the discussion later.
So I guess that brings me up. Coco Tomasian. I'm Program Manager in the Safety Policy Division with the CPUC. And I guess I bring up the energy prices portion of this panel. A topic I'm sure is near and dear to everyone's heart, as most of you are probably ratepayers. The PUC has a very broad and challenging role to balance the safety and reliability of utility systems while maintaining affordable rates. And as you can imagine, those tenets of the agency's mandate are often in conflict, as increasing safety and reliability inevitably costs money. And so balancing and finding that right balance of what are just and reasonable rates is at the core of the Commission's mission. Believe it or not, I've actually worked on wildfire policy as it relates to utilities dating back to 2012, shortly after I joined the Commission in 2011. And the Commission has been working on utility wildfire policy issues dating all the way back to 2008, shortly after the 2007 wildfires down in San Diego County that impacted a number of folks. And really, in earnest, a lot of the Commission's efforts in ratcheting up wildfire policy and regulation around that began shortly, thereafter. And in the context of economics, that's something we directly work on as far as how to set prices for utility systems, and how those are done are typically in our general rate case proceedings. Those are once every 4-year application proceedings open to the public, subject to intervener and stakeholder participation, thousands of pages of work papers and testimony and evidentiary hearings and briefings. And ultimately, in those proceedings, we have to balance how do we weigh where to allocate money, how much money to allocate, and for which types of programs. And I will say that is quite a challenging endeavor, especially considering the increasing wildfire risk. And I think you heard on the previous panel a little bit about how some of the impacts of liability and how that factors into utilities' decision makings on spending. I am happy to say that I believe in the utility sector, especially in the electric utility sector in California, we are leading the way in a lot of policy and risk assessment issues as it pertains to wildfire risk. And I'm happy to discuss those in more detail as we continue on the panel. So I'll stop my remarks there.
So I'm going to start with some questions, but you guys should all feel free to talk to each other as well as answering my questions. First, but I'm going to start with Rachel. And you mentioned that you provide advice as well as analysis. And the last panel talked about, here we have these three, the suppression versus mitigation. And what are the political trade-offs, and how is Sacramento deciding these trade-offs that they have to allocate money to? And so the LAO must be talking to them about what goes on. How do they think about it? You don't necessarily have to say how you guys recommend things, but how are they thinking about it? What are the contexts of why people might not be listening to these brilliant minds that were on the last panel that all seem to agree that we get a lot more bang for the buck by doing mitigation than suppression?
Yeah, I mean, again, we are spending a lot more on mitigation now than we were even 5 years ago. A lot more. And the voters are chipping in too in terms of approving Proposition 4, the climate bond that was on the ballot in November and included, as was mentioned, 1.5 billion new, first time ever that forest health resilience type activities have ever been included in a general obligation bond that I'm aware of. But those increases have been kind of dwarfed by the increases in response and CAL FIRE's budget in particular, in terms of on an ongoing basis. So I think in terms of prioritization, the first priority is still protect and make sure that the firefighters have the resources when a fire breaks out. That is the first priority for my bosses. But I do, again, think that the conversation has really changed around this idea of prevention and what can we be doing, a greater understanding of the decades-long practice of put out a fire as soon as it starts has resulted in really unhealthy forests with too much combustible material that is drying out with longer, hotter, drier summers. And we've seen that over the past few years. So the big issue I would say that we haven't quite cracked yet is the ongoing nature of that work. That we were lucky enough to have a budget surplus for a few years. We put a lot of that money into doing some of these forest health projects, but now we have a budget downturn and we haven't built in ongoing money for those activities. And the nature of the problem is large enough that we need more ongoing funding to keep addressing it, but also, as was noted in the first panel, the stuff grows back. It's not like building a water treatment plant that you can build with a bond and then kind of walk away and on it goes. It really does require a sustained effort. And I would say that that's still a nut that we as a state and in terms of our budget haven't quite cracked. We don't have that kind of ongoing, sustained source of funding. So I'm going to answer the last question on the previous panel of what kind of economic research would we like to see done. And for me, it's really how do we bring more payers into the system? How is it not just general fund, general taxpayer dollars that are supporting this money? Because our tax revenue is very volatile in the state of California, and as we have seen with this, we spend a lot when we have a surplus, and then when the stock market goes down, we have a lot less. So, there's a professor, Roger Bales, out of UC Merced, who's been doing a lot of research about water supply from the watersheds and the benefit of more healthy forests and water supply, which has encouraged some water agencies to invest in forest health projects. So those types of creative research where we can say, hey, what are the benefits? What are the benefits, as was talked about on the first panel too, of doing some of the home hardening projects that can make homeowners chip in some of their money too? So how do we bring more payers into the system by showing the benefits of some of these work? I think that might be helpful because the ongoing nature of the work we haven't quite built into our state budget yet.
So it also seems to me like ongoing nature when you have no politician ever called a hearing to say, here, let's talk about the fires you didn't have. And they hear a lot about the fires you did have and why you didn't respond in the way you had. So there's a political influence that way, and also term limits, right? That the longer term planning. So I think those things probably come into what happens for how, even though you give them advice to do one thing, they may not be quite willing to do as much. Do you find that happening, or?
Yeah, and again, the long-term, yes, so the long-term nature, if you make the investment now, when do you see the benefit, and what is the counterfactual? And so I think that's also research to show, and CAL FIRE is starting to do some of that work where they can go in and say, look, we put this fire break in, and we can see that resulted in a change in fire behavior, kind of an after-the-fact type of research. So I think that's helpful too, to try and make the case that it's not just the firefighters that are worthwhile for the investment.
So Nita, you talked about sort of what happens in your office, and I'm first thinking is there a difference between wildfires or other things like earthquakes and other things that you would have a difference in how you would approach things, or your office would approach what's going on in terms of what you need to do?
Not from the perspective of what the disaster is, but it depends on the information we're able to gather and the impact of the disaster. And the assumption would be the impact of wildfire may be different from the impact of an earthquake, because what we're focused on is the physical damage to property. And for example, the Santa Cruz fire, I think 5 years ago, where we actually had team members go out with other local agencies and meet with property owners to learn about the impact on their property and what they were experiencing. And when you hear about the feedback we received from them, it's telling, because some of it is not physical damage to their property, and we had to explain to them that, we sympathize, we empathize, we know this is a very emotional time that you're going through, but we're limited in our role on how we can help you and the type of relief we can provide. And of course, the benefit of having those temporary setups with the different local agencies, if we're not able to help them, then we're able to refer them to another agency that's able to help them. And so that's one of the reasons why the assessor's office has been proactive. We have Proposition 8 that requires us to actually identify a decline in value, but we're proactive because if we can help, we want to help. I do want to pick up on something Rachel said. Well, two things. One, with regards to what's happening right now in Sacramento. And I think timing has a lot to do with it. Right now, everybody is still talking about the Southern California fires January 7th, and there's a lot of legislation being pushed through, and there's a lot of attention and support because it's very timely, it's very present. People want to help, and people want to figure out what can they do either from a budget perspective or legislation. So I think now is the time to push, and I think we're seeing some success. I know the assessor's offices are looking at legislation that we've started already, that we can push through that would allow to extend the relief period for property owners. Because, for example, if a resident in Santa Clara County is impacted by a wildfire, they have only up to 12 months to file a property tax relief claim form. Basically to say, this happened to my home, I'm applying for a tax relief. As you heard in the previous panel, and we know just from experience, if your home is destroyed from a wildfire or any disaster, this is the last thing on your mind, right? And so dealing with other things, your family, pets, whatever it is, getting everything in order, finding a temporary home, this is not your priority. And we may think 12 months is a long time, but it's not. And so that's one of the things that we're looking at, whether or not we need to extend the time for property owners to file for property tax relief. Rachel also mentioned property taxes. So for county property taxes, we raise it locally, we spend it locally. And I wanted to share with you, so I mentioned our annual assessment roll. It's divvied up among school districts, cities, special districts. And just to give you a flavor of what that looks like, approximately 44% of the total amount goes to our schools. Just think about that. And then 12% to our county, 10% to our cities, and then the rest is special districts and other entities. And so when we have a wildfire or a disaster that affects the value of homes, and there's a decline or reduction in the value of home, that also reduces the number of property tax values we're bringing in or revenue we're bringing in. And so there's less revenue going to these recipient entities. Santa Clara County, for example, they receive 12%, roughly 12% of the total amount, but it's 36% of the county's general fund dollars that rely on property tax dollars. So that talks about the impact of the economic impact on the county and these different jurisdictions when we have a disaster that directly impacts property values.
And that has been an area where the state has come in to backfill some of these
Yes.
losses in major fires. They did it in Paradise, and there was just a bill to provide it for Los Angeles County as well, for at least for the first year.
Right.
I don't know for how long, for ongoing. And for schools, it's automatically backfilled through our school funding formulas. But counties and cities, it's not automatic. Though the legislature historically has made a choice to use state resources to backfill. I think there is a question of whether, if we continue to have large urban fires repeatedly, whether the state budget will be in a position to do that. But thus far, that has been a choice the state has made.
Because I think with the Sonoma fires, the state wasn't able to step in. I think there was a request from the board, and they weren't able to step in to help. Yeah.
I guess that depends also on the state's budget.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
And maybe not this year as opposed to 3 years ago, where they had.
I mean, again, this year the LA fires have been a priority,
Yeah.
and so the estimate right now is that it's about between $100 and $200 million for the year of lost property revenue that the state is backfilling, at least for this year.
So in the context of the state budget, it's not a big number, right? Yeah. Okay. So Coco, one of the things in California, a lot of our the fire costs are put into volumetric prices, the per kilowatt hour usage prices that you have, and they've kind of just recently done a change to have some fixed income-based fixed charges. Is that something that's going to change how you pay for fire stuff? That it should be in that, or that for the PG&E in Southern California Edison?
So for the most part, the primary bulk of wildfire mitigation work that impacts utility rates and customer bills is going to be found in what is spent on mostly preventative work when it comes to vegetation management, which is a significant line item in utility budgets for general rate cases. And as well as probably the biggest line item is various types of grid hardening. I think earlier I heard a question to the previous panel about undergrounding and some of the discussion around that. It is a very effective mitigation from the perspective of reducing wildfire risk, but it is also the most costly grid hardening mitigation. And there are other things and different utilities doing. And so as far as the impacts on wildfire mitigation work that happens, I don't see that being changed by the changes you're describing. And the other area that I'll just highlight that also, clearly impacts utility rates is in the event where you do have a wildfire, regardless of cause. Take, for example, the Eaton fire that destroys a significant amount of infrastructure. Well, that infrastructure needs to be rebuilt, and it needs to be rebuilt quickly, generally. There are opportunities during those times when you're doing massive infrastructure and whole rebuilds to find cost efficiencies and synergies with other repair and recovery work. And so in those ways, you can, in the wake of a wildfire, get some benefits that you might not, and it's kind of a weird way to say it, but you might not otherwise have in a normal situation where you're, taking existing infrastructure and wanting to replace it. And so from a cost perspective, I don't see the shift in how pricing structure is done being directly impacted by wildfire mitigation spending. It's more so, kind of the volumes of work and the type of work being done and where it's being done. I think I heard that on the previous panel too, and it's an area of focus, that we drive a lot, is ensuring that you're getting the best cost efficiency in regards to return on investment and targeting the types of work in the areas of highest risk to, reap those rewards from a cost benefit perspective.
So do you have an idea of what percentage of people's utility electric bills is fire mitigation?
I don't want to misspeak here, but I will say it's roughly on the order of about 10%. That's from a graphic I've recently seen. I will caveat that by saying I'm an engineer by education, not an economist like many of you, or an attorney. But in recent documentation that I've reviewed, I think the estimates are roughly around 10%, but that can vary based on rate case cycle as well as by utility.
And I'll just say, electricity rate affordability is a major topic of discussion in Sacramento right now. It's a major area of concern, and knowing that wildfire mitigation activities are a large portion of it, particularly for the investor-owned utilities, is also a big piece of conversation. So there are some conversations about are there opportunities to move some of those costs out of rates and use other sources of funding, whether it be from our cap and trade program or general fund is talked about. It's not a great year for using that, but it is a major, electricity affordability is one of the top kind of hot topics, I would say, in Sacramento right now, and this is a big piece of it. So there are a lot of discussions. It's a hard nut to crack, but there are a lot of discussions around, are there other ways to take those out of rates, given concerns about rates and the importance of electricity to our electrification and greenhouse gas reduction goals.
So thinking about, we've talked, you're working in the state, you're the county, you're the state, but also thinking about electric utilities. How do you think about who should be clearing this stuff and bearing the burden, and how the costs are divided in terms of, I'm going to ask you two questions, and one is the prevention costs, and then what happens after a fire as to who bears the costs of these things, if you have ideas about those.
So as far as prevention costs, those are generally shared by all ratepayers. So whether you live in a high fire area or you don't, it is baked into your utility rates. I thought there was an interesting discussion towards the end of the last panel about whether there should be, a different approach for people, maybe having to pay different prices that live in different areas based on their risk profile and risk appetite by choosing to live in certain areas. That is not something that, we have any specific direct control over. That said, as far as on the post, after a wildfire event, as was discussed at length in the previous proceeding in California, and the way our liability laws are set up, if a piece of utility infrastructure is found to have caused an ignition, and regardless of what the utility's actions prior or post that particular ignition may have been, often they're on the hook for liability from a legal perspective, and that gets baked into how they approach a lot of things, and so that can impact rates from both direct and indirect perspectives. From the direct perspective, they will want to invest more heavily in things that will reduce that risk as significantly as possible, as quickly as possible. From an indirect perspective, utilities borrow money to invest and produce these major and complete these major capital programs. Well, when their credit rating is reduced because they're a riskier company to lend to and invest in, well, their cost of borrowing capital increases, and guess what? That cost of borrowing capital and the interest paid on that is also passed down indirectly, right, back to ratepayers. And so you kind of have the all the investment that happens and the costs that go into that, and then on the post wildfire perspective, at the end of the day, even if a utility is not involved, like take, for example, the January fires we were just talking about, I think a few days after that, PG&E's stock price, so PG&E's nowhere near where those fires occurred, I don't recall the specific numbers, but took a significant hit and decreased. And so, the the financial industry is watching the market and it is sensitive to these types of events, and it does impact, ultimately the finances and how utilities are operating their business, and then all of that eventually in some form or fashion builds and makes its way into utility rates, whether that be directly or indirectly.
I think another issue that's really significant right now is the role of the federal government. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Assistance Agency, has played a major role historically in helping address disaster cleanup and recovery. It depends on the disaster declaration and whether it's a federal disaster or state disaster or major disaster, but kind of rough rule of thumb is that if it is a federal disaster, that FEMA will pay about 75% of the public infrastructure, kind of recovery, debris removal, and rebuilding of public infrastructure, and then the state and local governments will share the remaining 25%. For the LA fire, under the Biden administration, there was actually a commitment to cover 100% for the first 180 days of costs. Now, the new federal administration is indicating a desire to kind of dramatically change the role of FEMA, to shift roles that the federal government has traditionally played instead to states, potentially with some funding, potentially with block grants, we don't know. We're continuing to get reimbursements so far for some of the LA work, and actually the federal government is doing a fair amount of the debris removal right now. But there is potential for that to change pretty significantly, which could have major fiscal implications for the state, for local governments. The federal government's already ended a significant program of disaster mitigation, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, BRIC program, that provided federal funding after a state had experienced a disaster to do mitigation activities to try and prevent future disasters. That program's now been eliminated. So I think when we think about kind of recovery and government budgets, that could be a very significant change in the landscape for fires and other disasters.
And along those same lines, when you think about what's happening right now at the federal government with regards to county funds. So Santa Clara County relies heavily, like many other counties, on funding from the federal government, especially with regards to our health and hospital system. And so a huge portion of that comes from the general fund budget of the county. And so if we do have a wildfire or another disaster that impacts the property value, which impacts the revenue dollars we're bringing in, then the county would have to figure out how to make it up if they're not getting reimbursed and the federal funding dollars that we've relied on so heavily for forever. And so that's another consideration, going back to Greg's question about who covers the economic cost, right? Lawsuits may follow. We don't know how long those lawsuits may take to get resolved, but the immediate economic impact and who covers the cost, unfortunately, it's not an easy question to answer. It's going to impact schools, as I mentioned, special districts, and unfortunately, a lot of these jurisdictions don't have this, large rainy day fund to backfill and pay for the things that the property tax dollars normally cover. And so it's really an unfortunate situation. You always hope it never happens, and you can try to plan for it as much as you can, but it is a tricky situation when it happens. Like, who covers that cost? Because there's a huge cost when a wildfire or disaster happens. And then on the individual, the cost to the individual. Just to have to rebuild to new building codes and the cost associated with that. The time it takes to rebuild, finding temporary home, it depends on how much you've lost during the fire. All of that individual cost to the property owner. There's no, ideally they would recover it through lawsuits, but there's no immediate cost dollar pool to provide for them. And so these are things, even though in the assessor's office it's not directly part of our role, these are things that come up when we meet with property owners, because these are the questions and challenges they have when there's a disaster.
So following up on that, Rachel mentioned earlier the direct and indirect budget effects. And I think in the assessor's office, and you can also talk to this, Rachel, is the indirect effects of, there are a whole bunch of houses that burn down near my store. My store is fine, but I'm going to have a lot fewer sales And do people, how does the county take account of, sort of the overall, the indirect effects of things like that? Does that affect assessors' valuations of property for businesses that lose sales and things like that? And do they come to you, and how does that work?
Yes, so again, there are forms that they can file for us to do a reassessment, and we also have a duty to identify declinations in value. So the duty is on the assessor, but also they can proactively file different claim forms for us to go out and have our team go out and do the assessment. But it's, they would have to meet certain metrics. It's not automatic, and there's no guarantee. They may believe that, it did reduce in value, but we have to go through the formula to confirm that it actually has.
And then the county has to make up the revenue if you do determine it's gone down.
Yes.
Yeah.
I guess the only thing I would just build on with that is thinking, that example of the store and the community, I think to put yourself in the position of this community and think about the economic impacts as well as the emotional impacts, and how long they can last. I was just looking from Paradise. I think there were 15,000 residential units that burned, and as of today, about 3,500 have been rebuilt. So you think about that community trying to rebuild, how long it takes, and some folks never come back, and what the character of the community is from an emotional level, but then when you think about it from an economic level too, how many folks are going to that store, and how many years will it take to come back. So I know that that's a big concern about LA, and that's a lot of the discussion in Sacramento is how quickly can we get this done? What building codes can we waive? What coastal act can we waive? How can we get this done really quickly? But particularly when we don't really know what the role of the federal government is even going to be, it does raise a lot of questions. And there are a lot of policy decisions too about how quickly do you go versus should we try and rebuild these homes all electric because those support our greenhouse gas reduction goals? Or should we try and increase the density here so that we can try and meet some of our housing goals? But wait, what does that mean about reassessing the property value and my Prop 13 protection if I want to increase the footprint of my home? So this tension between trying to go as fast as possible versus all of these other considerations and questions, I think is very, very timely right now in LA.
And the data shows, just to pick up on what Rachel said, it does take at least 7 years to rebuild after a wildfire. Just think about that. Even if you're familiar with the building permit process in any city, that can take a long time. Moreover, you're dealing with a disaster, you're dealing with a lot of emotions, and so it takes at least 7 years to rebuild. I don't have the specific numbers with me, but in Santa Cruz, Sonoma, I think Paradise, they still have not rebuilt 100% of the homes that were damaged, right? And it has to do with, as Rachel said, just the time to rebuild, the permitting process, learning the process, the cost to rebuild to new codes. I think one of the attendees mentioned, I think he had his home 30 years ago. And just think if you had to rebuild your home, it got destroyed in a fire and you had to rebuild your home today, you would have to rebuild it to the new building codes, right? Which is more expensive and time consuming. And the question is, does it really have to be to the new building codes? Is there a waiver that could happen to expedite that process? So there's a lot that goes into this calculation.
Yeah, and ultimately, I think what you're hearing from everyone here is to answer the original question of who pays. I think the short answer is everyone pays. All of us in this room, all of us in this state, in one way or another, whether directly or indirectly, are paying for the costs and the impacts of these wildfire events.
Great. So I want to turn to you guys for questions at this point, if there are any questions. You want to start up here in the front? Wait for a microphone.
Excuse me.
And then we'll get to you.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah, I'll focus on energy prices, but before that, I'll give some background from the previous panel as well. So most of the focus was mitigation and suppression. And mitigation mostly was like controlled burn, the forest management and all. But if we go to the first principle, what it takes to start a fire, right? It needs heat source, it needs fuel, it needs oxygen, 3 ingredients, right? So controlled burn will take care of the fuel, mostly vegetation. But how do we control the ignition sources? And that impact on energy prices? So the question will be mostly to Coco, but anybody can chime in. Thank you.
It's a great question, and I think it's at the core of how we are dealing with wildfire risk and wildfire risk mitigation at the PUC. In the previous panel, they mentioned Senate Bill 901. That was a broadly sweeping bill. One of the other things that Senate Bill 901 did was it created a requirement for utilities in California to file extensive wildfire mitigation plans. These are 1,000-plus page documents that touch on every aspect of utility operations, assessment of risk, situational awareness, how they design and inspect and maintain the grid, how they maintain vegetation in and around their grid, how they communicate with their local communities and their stakeholders. And so to answer your question about how do we control the sources, I think the first part that answering that question is understanding where those sources are coming from. I think for those who are not very intimately familiar with the utility infrastructure, it's easy to look at a pole and say, well, there's a piece of wood and some power lines up there, and that can cause a fire. Well, the machination of how that ignition source takes place is very important to prescribe and kind of develop specific targeted mitigations to reduce those sources, right? And so you hear a lot about undergrounding, especially recently. Another type of mitigation that a lot of utilities, especially in Southern California Edison has been the leader in this, is installing what they call covered conductor, which is a type of overhead wire, less costly than doing undergrounding. It has a coating that has some insulative properties, where if you do have an incident where you have a piece of vegetation fall off of a tree and it touches a line, it mitigates and prevents that ignition. Or you have an animal or a balloon, a metallic balloon that gets caught up in the lines, it prevents those types of ignitions, but does so in a much more cost-efficient manner than another type of mitigation. And so it's really about understanding what are the drivers of that ignition risk and that source, and then what are the types of mitigations you can develop to target those specific risk drivers. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. I think I heard in the previous panel someone said, yeah, undergrounding does make sense and it is very effective from a wildfire risk mitigation perspective, but not everywhere. You're not going to underground where it's bedrock, or you have very expensive trenching, and in other places where it might not make sense. And so it's really about understanding where the risks are, what the risk profiles are, and part of the base part of doing that is collecting the right data and information. And I'm proud to say California has been the nation's first we're the first in the nation, I should say, that has required since 2014. I was involved in that proceeding to get utilities to collect and report ignition data. Back then it was thought of, well, this is a waste of time. Why do we need to collect it and report this data? And shortly thereafter, we saw the value of that data, and analyzing that information really gives us insights into what the risks are, what are driving these types of ignition risks. And you can see that they differ, across the state and by utility, and even within utility service territories. Think about PG&E that serves 34, 35 counties, right? And so you have a massive territory, and it's, the risks you face in San Francisco are very different than you might somewhere in Butte County. And so it's very important to track and collect the right types of data, understand and analyze that information to be able to tailor the right types of mitigations to drive both risk reduction as well as doing it in a cost-efficient manner. We were talking earlier, and Rachel mentioned, rate affordability is at the forefront, not just of the legislature, but of the commission. It's in every conversation I have with decision makers and I have with my team. It's something that we actively think about on a day-to-day basis.
This is great. You said you were an engineer, not an economist, but you gave a great answer in my mind as someone who teaches cost-benefit analysis. I want to think about, we kind of thinking about a scale of, the benefits of undergrounding kind of are really high in some places and they're declining, and the risk of fire is, you want to compare those in every place. And I think that you said it in exactly the right way. As an economist, I would say it, so may give you a pass in my class already without even having taken it.
Thank you.
And
Jeanette?
maybe as we pass the mic, I'll just say, even though they have led to some of the bigger fires that we've had, utility ignitions are not the primary source of fires that we have in the state. I think one of the big factors is just more development in the WUI, in the wildland-urban interface. So there's more people in places closer to where the flammable material is. So, education. There are other activities besides just focusing on the utility infrastructure that are going to be really important.
And just to build on that point, sorry, but utility ignitions make up less than 10% of total wildfire ignitions in the state.
Yeah.
It's the issue you see is the confluence of utility ignitions and catastrophic wildfires, right? Is where you really have it's closer to 50% of the most catastrophic and damaging wildfires in the state have been caused by power line sources. And so, and then there's reasons for that, right? The things that make wildfires grow and spread very rapidly are also the things that cause power lines to fail. And so you see that confluence, and that's why there's been in our sector and what we do a concentrated focus on wildfire risk and wildfire risk mitigation. We have extensive risk analyses requirements for utilities as part of those general rate case processes, and every single utility, if it's not the top risk, it's in one of the top couple of risks for every utility in California is wildfire.
Great. Jeanette?
So I'm trying to figure out just now whether you just maybe answered my question, but I don't think yet. This is mostly for Coco, and I apologize for that, but anybody else could jump in. Coco, in the very beginning of your formal remarks, you mentioned that the PUC had been working on wildfire policy since, I think you said 2008, maybe even 2006, and that you've been doing it since 2012. I wonder if you could give some specifics of what that really means. I tend to think that policy looks to the future and says, if we do this, and maybe we should do that so that we can achieve a particular result. If wildfire policy has been on the PUC agenda since 2006, and we are today where we are today in California, it's a big question. So what was that wildfire policy work really?
Great question, and just to clarify, I said 2008 was the year following the 2007 wildfires in San Diego County. There was extensive policy work, and so part of that work was reassessing and evaluating our regulatory requirements. So the Commission has general orders that establish requirements for how utilities must design, construct, maintain overhead facilities. There was a thorough re-examination of that. As part of that process, the Commission ended up developing what it currently uses as our high fire threat district maps that brought in fire scientists and experts from CAL FIRE, third parties from the utilities. Through these processes, the utilities have invested heavily and significantly in better understanding how to model risk within their territories and forecast different weather and climate issues. They've hired teams of meteorologists. These were things that didn't exist 10 years ago. And so through these policy efforts, you've seen significant changes. We've collected significant amounts of data to be able to better analyze the impacts of the situation and what we're doing. And I think someone said earlier, it's very difficult to prove a negative. If there are no utility-caused wildfires, no one's coming and giving me or my team a pat on the back and saying, great job, or going to PG&E and saying, yeah, you did a great job. It's in the aftermath of those events that we kind of zero in and focus on that, and rightfully so. But it's really understanding, and so from a policy perspective, we've developed new regulation and changing how inspections are done, how vegetation management is done throughout the state. We've developed policies around wildfire mitigation plans. If none of you are familiar with those, have seen those, I would highly encourage you to check them out. They are extremely extensive and thorough documents. that establish, and all have been established through policy, whether it's initially stimulated by statute and legislation that was passed, or internally through the Commission's own processes of proceedings and the public process.
Great. You want to pick Ben?
Closest one, I guess.
Yeah.
I work in venture investment for prevention or treatment of disease. And a lot of this sounds like the same problem. And so Mark Dugan sent me to Michael Kremer's work, who won a Nobel Prize on it, on analyzing when do we invest in prevention versus treatment. The problem is prevention costs a lot more than we think it does, because it tends to be an ongoing cost. It's not a short-term cost, and so the prevention we pay for is the one that has a 3-year payout. And so I'm very worried about how do we get enough money fast enough, or be realistic about the time scale to switch from treatment to prevention.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that was the first panel talked about that. I think we all agree. I guess one factor that's starting to be a bigger conversation, I was just in a 4-hour hearing about it yesterday, and I think it's really key, is the problem is so massive, the dollars are limited, so how can we be strategic? You know, there was a great, the former executive officer of the Sierra Nevada Conservancy used to talk about, let's avoid doing random acts of restoration, which I think is a great visual to think about if you're thinking about forest treatments, where you could put a bunch of money into a spot here, and then a spot here, and a spot here, a spot here, and if there's too much fuel still in between them all, the wildfire just comes through anyway. So how are we being strategic about large landscape level projects that are located in key spots that either are really key for protecting communities or for protecting water supply near reservoirs, so that we don't get a big fire near a reservoir that comes and then all the dirt runs off into the middle of the reservoir and loses our storage capacity. So I think, again, that over the past few years in Sacramento, that's become an increasing part of the conversation too, is it's not just money, because we don't have enough money. And it doesn't matter how much money we put at it, it's still not gonna be enough. And so how do we target our dollars really strategically? And that's true both for forest treatments, but also for community protections. You know, it is really expensive to fully harden a home and do all, you know, eliminate all the vegetation around it, put new siding in, put a new roof in, take care of the vents. It's extraordinarily expensive. And so where can the state dollars really play an important role to incentivize some of the behavior, and what are the most cost-effective treatments if you can't do it all? And so I don't have the answers. I don't think any of us do. Again, in this hearing I sat in for 4 hours yesterday, the silver bullet wasn't there, but I think that the nature of the conversation is changing a little bit to try and say, how do we stretch our dollars more, and how do we focus them on the most effective strategies? And I think that's going to be key.
Come over here.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Well, on that theme of how do we use our dollars most effectively, it seems that we really have two aspects of prevention, reducing the fuel sources, but really we're trying to prevent big fires. And so early detection and response technologies are drastically more cost effective. They don't replace the other need, but I would be interested in hearing more about how we can put significantly greater resources than we have today, but proportionately fewer resources than we have to put into either response or fuel reduction by these early detection and response technologies.
Yeah, I mean, that's happening. And again, I think that's an area where we've made a lot of progress just in the past few years, in particular because of technology developing. I heard someone from CAL FIRE yesterday talking about the satellites we're using to try and detect, and LIDAR to try and detect ignitions. So I think that is definitely part of the conversation. I think just another point to bring up, though, is that we're not going to end every fire, and being really honest about that conversation as well. Some of the conversation about the LA fires, just given those winds, you know, those, you could detect it and those embers were still going to fly that quickly. It just moved so fast. So yeah, trying to remove the fuels, trying to reduce the ignitions, trying to find the ignitions quickly when they happen, but then also conversations around, okay, well, when fire does happen, are we prepared to, with fuel breaks, with hardened homes, with community protection to try and respond? I think these are all different parts of the conversation we're going to need to have, because we're not going to get it through any one of these avenues.
And to that point, Rachel and Pat Burt, who is on Palo Alto City Council, he'll appreciate this too, because a lot of city councils right now are revisiting their disaster preparedness plans and figuring out how do they engage with the community now, based on lessons learned from Southern California. But also we are seeing where more homes are being built in fire zone areas, and so we want to make sure that our community is engaged, they have the right checklist, and the assessor's office, of course, wants to be on that checklist. We want to make sure if you qualify for property tax relief that you get it. But I do think the education piece and being proactive, engaging the community, you know, making sure you have contact information, making sure they have the information they need, hardening homes, having that break if possible. But it's interesting that you mentioned the Southern California fire, because you're right. Some of the homes that were destroyed there weren't in the traditional fire zones, right? But because of the wind, they were affected. And so we can do everything we can, and we should, but it doesn't mean it's going to be 100% proof.
I think you know, your point of, hey, we have all this more technology for you know, observation and detection. I think also the utilities have detection systems as well on their line, so they know when they've been breached or when they shut
Absolutely.
off quick shut off.
So utilities have invested heavily in detection and response, right? They've partnered with Alert Wildfire. There's cameras, dense camera network that actually also supports the fire agencies, and I'm sure I think there's some CAL FIRE folks on the panels later and maybe speak to any of that. But there's technologies that determine, you know, and shut off power to limit energy release. There's technologies utilities have been piloting and installing that try to preeminently determine whether there's an incipient and potential failure to go out and get out ahead and do inspections on lines. There's satellite technologies, LiDAR, and so they're from a technology and a detection response perspective. Definitely, the utilities have driven a lot of, at least in the sector in California, have driven a lot of that response. And I think I would argue are kind of on the leading edge in the nation for sure on installation of detection and response. And obviously, it's not the utility that does the response directly, but coordinating that response also limits the potential for fire spread and increases the likelihood of containment. Assuming you can, right, given the weather and topography.
And those shutoffs are way cheaper than undergrounding too, way cheaper, so.
This has been a great panel. I've been given the signal that it's time to stop, but thank you guys all very much, and please join me in thanking the panel.